The sale itself would happen either on board the ship or a warehouse nearby.
Let the scramble commence!
Slaves would be inspected by prospective buyers who would poke and prod and open their mouths and all these things to try to assess the physical capacity of the slave.
So how much wealth does one person represent? For men, price rose with age.
Once we get to the 19th century, the cost of an enslaved person would approximate the cost of an automobile in today's dollars.
For women, it's a little bit different. Prices correlated with perceived years of remaining fertility. One of the attractions of slavery for enslavers, particularly men, is the sexual access that they believe it gives them. The role of violent, forced sexuality in the trade. We know that it was quite extensive.
From about 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homeland and forcibly shipped across the Atlantic, a journey that almost 2 million of them wouldn't survive. By the turn of the 18th century, European merchants were building vessels capable of transporting hundreds of slaves per journey. These ships had extra portholes for ventilation, weapons mounted on deck in case of rebellion, and additional compartments added below deck to take on more human cargo. Before boarding the ships at African port cities, slaves were stripped of their clothing and remaining possessions and had their heads completely shaved. During boarding, which could take weeks or even months, slaves lived on the deck of the ship in a temporary wooden house constructed by the crew. The crew also installed netting around the deck of the ship, designed to catch slaves who might opt for death over forced servitude. Once moved below deck, slaves would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage. They were segregated by gender and age. Adult men were kept separately and shackled in pairs. Women usually left unbound in their designated compartment, and children often free to move about the ship. There was no plumbing of any kind. Slaves were forced to relieve themselves where they sat, creating hellish conditions when combined with the heat and lack of ventilation below deck. Disease was rampant. Measles, smallpox, influenza, scurvy, and dysentery, the #1 killer, ravaged slaves and crew members alike. The slaves generally spent about 8 hours a day above deck, but were still separated by gender with a barricado, a reinforced wall that could be used to protect crew members in case of a revolt. Slaves were also subject to forced exercise, sometimes including dance and song for the entertainment of the crew. Disobedient slaves were tortured and beaten, usually whipped with the especially cruel cat-o'-nine tails, a tool designed to inflict maximum pain. Slaves who refused to eat their typical meal of rice and beans were forced to do so, sometimes with the speculum oris, a medieval tool used to pry open unwilling mouths. Women, while usually left unshackled, were raped and sexually abused by members of the crew, sometimes arriving in the New World carrying the children of their attackers. But it was the women, using their minuscule freedoms, who would often coordinate mutinies against their captors. But these rebellions were rarely successful. The true extent of the horrors of the Middle Passage came to light in a 1783 court trial over the slave ship Zong. The Zong left Africa in 1781 with 442 enslaved on board. After a 2-month journey riddled with navigation errors, 62 slaves and 7 crew members had perished without reaching their destination. Disease was spreading throughout the ship, and fresh water was running dangerously low. Captain Luke Collingwood was afraid of the financial cost of more deaths. Slaves that died of disease were not covered by the ship's insurance, but slaves who drowned were. Some 133 slaves were thrown overboard. Collingwood claimed it was necessary to do so to halt the spread of disease. At the trial between the Zong's owners and their insurance company, the owners argued that because it was legal to kill sick animals for the health of a ship, it was legal to treat infected slaves the same. The court agreed, but the trial itself exposed the horrors aboard the Zong. The story was republished by British abolitionists with the name of the ship redacted. meant to show that this tragedy could happen on any slave ship across the Middle Passage. 24 years after the Zong trial, the slave trade was outlawed in both Great Britain and the United States. It would take England another 26 years, and the US another 58, plus a civil war, before the practice of slavery was banned outright.